When Alpha Rowan bit another woman's neck beneath the sacred moon, the celebration exploded into cheers. No one noticed Lyra quietly set down the silver Luna clasp he had once promised she would wear forever. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply walked through the celebrating crowd and disappeared into the night. Most wolves pied her. Some mocked her. A few whispered that another rejected mate had finally learned her place. 7 days later, the first grain caravans failed to arrive. The eastern border closed without warning. 3 allied packs suddenly canceled their military agreements. Merchants refused to extend credit. Council meetings turned into shouting matches because no one knew where the missing reports had gone. Within another week, the kingdom that had spent 10 years becoming the strongest territory in the north was quietly beginning to unravel. Not because anyone attacked it, because one woman had stopped holding it together. The frightening part wasn't that she had left. The frightening part was that no one had ever realized how much of the kingdom had always been hers. 3 weeks before the Moon Festival, Lyra was still writing his name in the margins of trade reports out of habit. She caught herself doing it that morning, sitting at the long table in the Ashmore records room with sunlight cutting gold lines across stacks of ledgers. "Rowan," she'd written beside a column of grain projections before crossing it out and writing the correct notation instead. Alpha's approval pending. It looked more official that way. It looked like the words of someone whose place in this kingdom was settled. She told herself it was settled. 10 years of settled. 10 years since she'd walked into this castle as a 16-year-old orphan, with nothing but a sharp mind and a habit of noticing things other people missed. And Rowan's mother had looked at her across a council table and said, "This one sees what the rest of us walk past." 10 years of learning every treaty clause, every trade route, every pack's grudge, and every pax's pride, until she could predict a border dispute 3 months before the first harsh word was spoken. 10 years of Rowan squeezing her hand under the table during difficult negotiations and murmuring, "I don't know how you do it," as though her competence were a kind of magic rather than the plain arithmetic of paying attention. She believed him when he said he loved her. She still believed it mostly. That was the strange part. She didn't think Rowan was lying when he called her his mate in private, when he traced the line of her jaw and told her the kingdom would be hers someday too. She thought he simply hadn't yet noticed the difference between loving someone and choosing them in front of everyone who mattered. She was about to find out which one he'd chosen. The Moon Festival began the way it always did, with torches lit along the castle walls, and the pack gathering in the great courtyard beneath a sky scraped clean of clouds. Lyra wore the pale blue dress Elder Miriam had helped her choose, and she stood near the edge of the crowd, as she always did, close enough to see everything, and far enough to remain unnoticed. It was where she felt most useful. It was also, though she would not have admitted this even to herself, where she felt safest. Rowan climbed the dais in his ceremonial coat, and for one breath just before he opened his mouth, Lyra let herself hope in the specific foolish way a person hopes when they already suspect the answer. Then he turned and reached for Lady Celine's hand instead of hers, and the crowd's confusion turned to cheering before Lyra had even finished understanding the shape of what was happening. He said the old words, the claiming words, the ones he had once whispered to Lyra in the dark and told her were only for her. Celine tilted her head back, baring her throat with the practiced grace of a woman raised since birth to expect exactly this moment, and Rowan's teeth found her skin, and the courtyard roared its approval. And somewhere in the noise, Lyra reached up and unclasped the silver Luna pendant from around her neck. She had worn it for 2 years. He'd given it to her in private, told her it wasn't official yet, that he needed the council's blessing first, that these things took time in a kingdom like Ashmore, where bloodlines still mattered to the old families. She had understood. She had always understood. Understanding was the thing she was best at. She set the pendant on the low stone wall beside her gently. The way a person sets down something they intend to leave behind rather than something they've dropped by accident. Then she turned and walked through the celebrating crowd, and no one stopped her because no one was looking at her at all. She didn't run. Running would have made her the story. Instead, she walked at an ordinary pace through streets lit gold with festival lanterns, past merchants closing their stalls, and children chasing each other between market carts until the noise of the courtyard faded behind her, and the castle became a shape against the stars instead of a place she lived. She spent that night in the small room above the archive tower, the one she'd claimed years ago, because no one else wanted to climb that many stairs. She didn't sleep. She sat at her desk and opened her leather journal, the one filled with the decade of notes no one else had ever read, and she looked at the ink-stained pages of her own handwriting until the candle burned down to nothing. By the time the sky began to lighten, she had made her decision, and it did not feel like grief. It felt like arithmetic. She would take nothing that belonged to the kingdom. Not the maps she'd drawn, not the ledgers she'd built, not the treaty drafts still waiting for seals. Those things had never been hers to keep, only hers to make. She packed her journals, 3 changes of clothes, and the small collection of pressed white lies she'd kept between the pages of an old book since she was a girl. And she left everything else exactly where it belonged, in the kingdom that had never quite belonged to her. She was gone before the first servants woke to clean the courtyard of festival debris. No one noticed that either. For the first 3 days, Ashmore simply believed itself heartbroken on Lyra's behalf, and moved on the way kingdoms do with gossip and pity, and the particular cruelty of people who mistake sympathy for kindness. Lady Selene settled into the East Wing. Rowan held council as usual, signed the documents placed in front of him, nodded at reports read aloud by men who had never had to write one themselves. On the 4th day, the grain caravan from the southern valley did not arrive. It wasn't alarming at first. Caravans were sometimes delayed by weather, by broken wheels, by the ordinary friction of moving heavy carts across long distances. The steward assured the council it would arrive within 2 days. He was not lying. He simply did not know that the caravan's route had been quietly renegotiated 8 months earlier, after Lyra discovered the original path-crossed land claimed by a rival pack. Land whose ownership was disputed enough that a formal crossing required advance notice and a modest toll paid 3 seasons ahead. She had handled the toll herself in a private letter no one else had read, because handling it publicly would have required admitting the original route had been drawn incorrectly by a nobleman's cousin, who now sat on the Trade Council. The toll had not been paid this season. No one else knew it existed. The caravan sat at the border for 6 days, while its drivers argued with confused guards. And by the time it finally arrived, half its grain had spoiled in the heat. That was the first thread. It would have been easy to dismiss on its own, and for a few more days, Ashmore did exactly that. The eastern border closed on the 7th day. Lyra had spent 3 years building a fragile peace with the Bramblewood pack across that border, a peace held together not by treaty, but by a dozen small kindnesses, too minor to write down. She'd sent healers when their winter fever spread. She'd quietly forgiven a trade debt when their harvest failed. 2 years running. She'd remembered the name of their beta's daughter and sent a gift when the girl came of age. None of it appeared in any official record, because none of it had been asked of her. She had simply noticed what needed doing, and done it the way she noticed everything. When Bramblewood's beta sent his usual seasonal greeting, and received for the first time in 3 years, no personal reply, only a stiff formal acknowledgement, signed by a clerk who didn't know his daughter's name. He took it as an insult. He was not entirely wrong. Something had changed, even if no one in Ashmore understood what. The border closed within the week. No declaration of war, no dramatic confrontation, just silence and locked gates and a trade relationship built on invisible threads that had finally quietly snapped. By the 2nd week, 3 allied packs had canneled their mutual defense agreements, each for reasons that sounded reasonable in isolation, and only made sense together once someone finally sat down and traced them to their source. Merchants who had always extended Ashmore generous credit terms suddenly demanded payment in full upfront because the personal relationships that had made that generosity possible had never been formalized in any contract. They had existed in conversations Lyra had over tea with traders' wives, in favors remembered and returned in the particular trust that grows only between people who have proven themselves reliable to each other over years. Rowan called an emergency council session on the 14th day, and for the first time in his life as Alpha, he sat at the head of a table full of frightened, angry men and realized he did not know the answer to a single question they were asking him. "Where are the trade agreements with Bramblewood?" the treasurer demanded. "Who negotiated the Southern Crossing toll?" the steward asked, holding up a letter he'd only just discovered, written in unfamiliar handwriting, referencing a payment no one could locate. "Why does no one know who our contact is in Thornfield anymore?" Elder Miriam asked quietly, and something in her voice made Rowan look up. He didn't have answers. He had never needed answers before because someone had always simply provided them quietly, efficiently, without ever asking to be thanked or credited. He had signed treaties whose terms he vaguely remembered discussing. He had approved reports whose numbers he had never personally verified. He had believed in the comfortable, unexamined way powerful men often believe things, that the kingdom ran itself because he ran it well. It was Elder Miriam, gay-haired and sharp-eyed, who finally said the name no one else wanted to say aloud. "Where is Lyra?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Lyra crossed into Stonehaven 11 days after leaving Ashmore on foot, with her journals in a worn leather satchel and dust on her boots from 3 days of mountain roads. She had chosen Stonehaven deliberately, not because she expected welcome, but because its reputation suggested a kingdom that might at minimum judge her on the quality of her work rather than the circumstances of her arrival. Stonehaven was smaller than Ashmore, younger as a unified territory, built less on inherited prestige and more on the accumulated decisions of people who had earned their positions through demonstrated competence. It seemed from a distance like a place where a woman with no title and no name might still be useful. She presented herself at the gates of Stonehaven's capital, not as a runaway mate or a cautionary tale, but as what she had always actually been, beneath the title no one had ever officially given her, a strategic advisor seeking work. The guard who first questioned her found this claim mildly absurd, given her plain traveling clothes and the dust on her boots. But something in the calm, unhurried way she answered his questions convinced him to send word up the chain rather than turn her away outright. Word eventually reached Marshal Cedric, Stonehaven's commander, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, whose skepticism toward strangers arriving unannounced had been earned through decades of exactly that kind of trouble. "You want to advise the crown?" Cedric said, arms crossed, studying her across a table in the guardhouse. "And you have no letters of introduction, no former employer willing to vouch for you, and you won't tell me where you've come from." "I can tell you where I've come from," Lyra said. "I simply don't think it will help my case." Something in her steadiness made Cedric pause. He had interrogated liars before, and dreamers and desperate people willing to say anything for a meal and a roof. She was none of those things. She sat with her hands folded, unhurried, watching him the way he was used to watching other people. "Then convince me," he said, "that you're worth the risk of bringing before the king." So she did. She asked for the ledgers Stonehaven's own advisors had been arguing over for 3 months, a persistent shortfall in the northern grain reserves that no one could fully explain. And she read through them in an afternoon, and by evening she had identified not one problem, but 4, layered on top of each other, in ways that had made each individually invisible. A miscalculated tax exemption from 2 seasons prior, a merchant quietly overcharging for storage while underreporting spoilage, a road repair delay that had forced 2 extra weeks of transport costs no one had traced to their source. And beneath all of it, a simple clerical error repeated for months that had thrown off every subsequent calculation built upon it. Cedric read her notes twice before he believed them. Then he brought her, dust still on her boots, before King Adrian. Adrian was younger than Rowan by only a few years, but carried himself with a stillness that Lyra noticed immediately, the particular quiet of a man who had learned to listen before he spoke. He read Cedric's summary of her findings without interrupting, and when he finally looked up at her, his first question wasn't about her past or her intentions. "Why didn't the merchant get caught sooner?" he asked. "If this has been happening for months, someone should have noticed." "Because no one was looking at the whole picture," Lyra said. "Everyone in your treasury is very good at their individual piece of it. No one has the job of noticing how the pieces fit together or don't. And that's the job you're asking for." "It's the job I already know how to do," she said. "Whether you give it to me is a different question." Adrian studied her for a long moment, and Lyra had the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being looked at directly without the polite deflection people usually offered a stranger, without the dismissiveness she'd grown used to as an unmarried woman with no family name attached to hers. He wasn't looking at her the way Rowan had looked at her in private, warm and possessive and slightly proud, like she was a clever thing he'd acquired. He was looking at her the way you'd look at a locked door you'd just realized had a key. "Give her 3 months," Cedric said, surprising himself as much as anyone. "If she's half as good as this afternoon suggested, well, know within 3 months whether Stonehaven can afford to lose her again." Adrian nodded slowly. 3 months, he agreed, "and a fair wage in your own office if the work warrants it." "I don't need an office," Lyra said out of 10 years of habit. "You'll have one anyway," Adrian said, and something about the quiet finality in his voice, not commanding but simply certain, made her decide not to argue. She began work the following morning. Within the first month, Stonehaven's northern grain shortfall was resolved. The overcharging merchant was quietly removed from his contract, and 3 smaller inefficiencies LRA had noticed in passing. A badly timed tax collection schedule, an underused trade route through the eastern hills, a diplomatic letter to a neighboring territory that had gone unanswered for weeks were corrected without fanfare. She worked the way she always had. Early mornings and late nights, careful notes in her leather journal, quiet conversations with clerks and merchants and messengers whose names she learned and remembered, the invisible threading of trust and competence that had once held an entire kingdom together without anyone noticing the hand that would. The difference this time was that someone was watching. Adrian began finding reasons to walk past her office in the evenings, at first telling himself it was simple curiosity about the kingdom's finances, later admitting to himself, though not yet to her, that he had started looking forward to the particular quality of silence in a room where someone else was working just as hard as he was. She kept unusual hours, often working past midnight, surrounded by maps and ledgers. And more than once, he found himself standing in her doorway with 2 cups of tea, one of which he'd tell himself he'd simply made too much of. "You don't have to justify the tea," Lyra told him one night, 3 weeks into her employment, without looking up from the trade proposal she was annotating. "I'm allowed to accept a cup of tea without it meaning something. I wasn't aware I was justifying anything," Adrian said, setting the cup down beside her. "You always explain why you're here before you sit down. It's a very thorough explanation for someone bringing tea." He laughed, surprised into it, and sat down across from her anyway. "Fine, I like the company. Is that a better explanation?" "It's a shorter one," she said, and something in the way she almost smiled made him decide it was in fact the correct one. Their conversations grew longer over the following weeks, not through any dramatic confession, but through the accumulation of small honesties, the kind that only become visible in retrospect. He asked her once why she preferred working alone, and she told him carefully that she had spent 10 years being useful to people who never quite thought to ask her opinion on anything beyond the usefulness itself. He didn't press her for the details of where those 10 years had happened. He simply said, "That sounds lonely," in a tone that made it clear he understood loneliness wasn't the same thing as being unaccompanied, and she found herself for the first time in longer than she could remember telling someone the truth instead of the efficient version of it. She told him about Ashmore eventually. Not all at once, but in pieces over several late evenings. The way a person tells the truth when they finally found someone who seems genuinely more interested in understanding than in judging. She told him about the toll payment no one knew existed, the healers she'd sent to Bramblewood, the merchant's wife whose birthday she'd remembered for 6 years running. She told him about the Moon Festival, the silver clasp on the stone wall, the walk through a crowd too busy celebrating to notice her leaving. Adrian listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he didn't offer the outrage she expected, the immediate condemnation of Rowan that would have felt in that moment more like performance than comfort. Instead, he asked, "Did anyone ever say thank you for any of it?" The question caught her off guard enough that she had to think about it honestly. Rowan did privately. Often, actually, but never where anyone else could hear it. No, she admitted, never where anyone else could hear it. That's the part that was wrong, Adrian said. Not that he made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. It's that he let you become invisible and called it privacy. She didn't have a response to that. Not immediately, and the silence between them stretched long enough to become its own kind of conversation. Outside, the first frost of the season had begun to silver the palace gardens, and somewhere beneath the window, a stray white lily, entirely out of season, had pushed up through the cold ground, exactly where the sun struck the wall each morning. By the second month, Marshal Cedric had stopped questioning whether Lyra deserved her position and started actively seeking her counsel on matters far beyond finance, troop movements, seasonal patrol schedules, the delicate business of maintaining peace along 3 separate borders. He was a practical man, not given to sentiment, but he found himself telling his wife over dinner that the strange woman who'd walked out of the mountains with dust on her boots had somehow, in 8 short weeks, become the person everyone in the castle quietly relied on to know what was actually happening. "She reminds me of good soil," he told his wife, and when she raised an eyebrow at the comparison, he shrugged. "You don't notice good soil, you just notice everything grows." Elder Miriam's counterpart in Stonehaven, an aging archivist named Master Oren, took a particular liking to Lyra's habit of documenting everything in careful dated notes, cross-referenced and indexed in a system entirely her own invention. "You could teach a course on this," he told her one afternoon, flipping through one of her working journals with something close to reverence. "Half the mistakes this kingdom has made in the last decade could have been avoided if someone had kept records like these." "I've been keeping records like this for 10 years, Lyra said, and something in her voice made him look up. "Somewhere that never used them. Somewhere that never asked to see them," she corrected gently. Oren was quiet for a moment. "That's a particular kind of waste," he finally said. "Not wasting the work, wasting the person who did it." By the 3rd month, the difference between Stonehaven's steady, quiet prosperity and Ashmore's mounting chaos had become impossible to ignore, not just within the 2 kingdoms, but across the entire northern territories. Traveling merchants began speaking of Stonehaven's efficiency the way they once spoke of Ashmore's military strength. Smaller packs previously allied with Rowan's territory began sending careful exploratory letters to Adriana's court, testing whether new alliances might be possible. Adrian noticed the shift too, and when the Seasonal Trade Council convened that winter, gathering representatives from a dozen territories to renegotiate shared agreements, he made a decision that surprised his own advisors more than it surprised Lyra, though it surprised her too in its own way. "You'll draft the Northern Trade Proposal," he told her 3 days before the council, "and you'll present it yourself." "I can draft it," Lyra said carefully. "You should present it." "That's how these things work." "That's how these things have always worked," Adrian corrected. "It's not a law of nature. It's a habit, and habits can change." He paused, and something in his expression softened. "I watched you spend a decade building things other people took credit for. I'm not going to be the second man who does that to you." The Trade Council convened in Stonehaven's Great Hall 3 days later, with representatives from 9 allied territories seated around a long table beneath tall windows that let in the pale winter light. Lyra stood at the head of that table for the first time in her life. Not beside a throne, not in the shadow of someone else's authority, but in the position reserved for the person whose work the room had actually gathered to discuss. She presented the proposal the way she had always worked, clearly, patiently, anticipating every objection before it was raised, because she had spent 10 years learning exactly how objections formed in rooms like this one. When the Bramblewood Beta, present at Stonehaven's invitation as a gesture of renewed goodwill, recognized the careful diplomatic language she used, the specific attention to the concerns his pack had always felt went unheard. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I know this handwriting," he said slowly, holding up a copy of the proposal. "I've received letters like this before years ago. I always assumed they came from Ashmore's council directly." "They did," Lyra said simply. "I wrote them." The room went quiet in a particular way, the quiet of people recalculating something they'd assumed was settled. The Bramblewood Beta looked at her for a long moment, then set down the paper. "Then I owe you an apology," he said. I closed a border over a silence I assumed was contempt. "I didn't know it was grief." "You weren't wrong to be hurt," Lyra said. "You just didn't know what had actually happened. Neither did I until it was already done." By the end of that council, 3 territories had signed preliminary agreements with Stonehaven that Ashmore had spent years failing to secure, and King Adrian stood before the assembled representatives and did something Lyra had never once experienced in a decade of quiet, uncredited labor. "This agreement exists," he said, "because of the work of my strategic advisor, Lyra, whose name will appear on every copy of this treaty alongside my own, as our tradition requires for any advisor whose counsel shapes a kingdom's future." He turned to her, and the great hall's attention turned with him. "Some of you have already met her. Some of you have benefited from her work for years without knowing her name. That ends today." Lyra felt something shift in her chest, unfamiliar and slightly frightening. The particular vertigo of being seen after years of practiced invisibility. She had spent so long believing usefulness was the only currency she had to offer, that being offered recognition instead felt absurdly like standing on ground that might not hold her weight. Elder Miriam, present as an Ashmore observer, invited out of old courtesy, watched from the back of the hall with an expression LRA couldn't quite read, and later that evening sought her out privately. "I should have said something years ago," Miriam told her without preamble. "I saw what you were doing. I saw how much of it went unnamed. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in whatever understanding you and Rowan had reached." She shook her head slowly. "That was a failure of courage, not wisdom." "I'm sorry." "You don't owe me an apology," Lyra said, though something in her chest had gone tight. "I owe you several," Miriam said, "but I'll start with that one." She studied Lyra for a moment. "Does he know Rowan? Does he understand yet what happened?" "I don't know," Lyra admitted. "I haven't spoken to him since the festival." "You will," Miriam said, not unkindly. "Ashmore is drowning Lyra. Hell come looking for the thing that's missing eventually. Everyone does." Rowan arrived at Stonehaven's border 11 days later, alone without ceremony, having ridden 3 days through worsening weather, with the particular desperation of a man who has finally understood the size of his mistake and believes wrongly that understanding alone might be enough to fix it. He was not received as an alpha. He was received as a man requesting an audience, made to wait 2 full hours in Stonehaven's outer hall, while Cedric, deeply unimpressed by his unannounced arrival, decided whether the request was worth honoring at all. When he was finally brought before Adrian, with Lyra present at the king's right hand, as she had been for every significant audience for the past month, Rowan's carefully prepared apology died somewhere in his throat. He hadn't expected her to look like this. Not broken, not waiting, not softened by 6 months of grief into someone eager to hear him say the words he'd rehearsed the entire ride north. She looked instead exactly like what she was, a woman with her own seal on treaties, bearing her own signature, standing in a hall where her presence was expected rather than tolerated. "I came to apologize," he said finally, and his voice, usually so certain in council chambers, came out rougher than he intended. "What I did at the festival was a mistake. I understand that now. I understand what I lost." "What did you lose?" Adrian asked before Lyra could answer, his tone carefully neutral. "I'm curious how you'd describe it." Rowan hesitated, and something in the hesitation was its own kind of answer. "The kingdom is falling apart," he said. "Nothing works the way it used to. I didn't understand how much of it depended on." He stopped himself, and Lyra watched him search for a word that wouldn't sound like what it actually was. "On me?" she finished quietly. "Yes," he admitted. And to his credit, he didn't look away from her when he said it. "I built 10 years of success, and told myself it was because I was a strong alpha. I never once considered that it might have been because someone strong was standing behind me making it possible." He took a breath. "I want you to come home, Lyra. I'll make it right. I'll give you the title you always should have had." "You want me to come back?" Lyra said slowly. "So I can fix what I built the first time." "I want you to come back because I was wrong," Rowan said. "Both things can be true." "They can," and Lyra agreed. "But only one of them is why you're actually here." The silence that followed was long enough for Rowan to understand finally and completely exactly what he'd lost. Not a woman waiting to be reclaimed. A partner he'd never once treated as one whose absence had revealed the true architecture of everything he'd assumed was his own strength. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said quietly. "I don't think I've earned that. I'm asking whether there's anything I can do." "You could start," Elder Miriam said from where she stood near the door, having arrived unannounced from Ashmore herself, "by learning the names of the people who actually keep your kingdom running. All of them. Not just the ones who share your bloodline." Rowan left Stonehaven 3 days later without the reconciliation he'd hoped for, but with something else instead. A clear, painful understanding of exactly what leadership required that he had never once demonstrated. It wasn't the ending he wanted. It was, Lyra thought later, watching his party disappear down the mountain road. Probably the only ending that could have actually taught him anything. The invasion came from the Eastern Empire of Voren, 4 months later in early spring, while the northern territories were still adjusting to the new balance of power between Ashmore and Stonehaven. Voren's forces crossed the disputed borderlands in 3 coordinated columns, striking Ashmore first precisely because Rowan's weakened, still recovering kingdom offered the easiest path north, and Stonehaven understood immediately that Ashmore's fall would not stop there. The council that convened in Stonehaven's Great Hall that night was unlike any other Lyra had attended. Urgent and frightened in ways trade negotiations never were, because the maps spread across the table now marked burning villages instead of grain routes. "We could let Ashmore fall," Cedric said grimly, tracing the invasion's projected path with a steady finger. "Voren's forces would be exhausted by the time they reached us. We'd be fighting a weakened enemy on our own ground, and thousands of Ashmore's people would die waiting for us to make that calculation." "Adrian said Rowan rejected this woman in front of his entire kingdom," Cedric said, glancing at Lyra without apology. "I'm not suggesting cruelty. I'm suggesting strategy." All eyes in the room turned toward Lyra, and she understood with the particular clarity she'd always brought to difficult decisions that whatever she said next would determine not just the fate of 2 kingdoms, but the answer to a question she'd been quietly carrying since the night she set down a silver clasp on a stone wall and walked away without looking back. "Ashore isn't Rowan," she said finally. "The people dying in those villages didn't reject me. Finn's family didn't reject me." She looked around the table at Cedric's grim calculation, at Adrian's careful patience, at Miriam's steady attention. "I spent 10 years learning every name in that kingdom because I believe they mattered individually, not just as pieces of a strategy. I'm not going to stop believing that now because it would be convenient." You're asking us to risk Stonehaven's soldiers to save a kingdom that never valued you, Cedric said, not unkindly testing the shape of the argument rather than opposing it outright. I'm asking you to save people who never had the power to value or reject me in the first place. Lyra said, the council that failed me was a handful of men in a castle. The kingdom is thousands of families who had nothing to do with that decision. Adrienne had been quiet through the exchange, watching her with the particular attention he'd shown since the first afternoon she'd walked into his guardhouse with dust on her boots. There's also a strategic argument, he said finally. A unified northern front is stronger than two separate exhausted kingdoms. Whatever the emotional calculation, the practical one points the same direction. Then we have both reasons, Lyra said. That should make the decision easier, not harder. Cedric studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The particular nod of a soldier who has just watched someone make an argument he respects more than he expected to. Then we ride within the day, he said. Both our reasons and yours. Stonehaven's forces reached Ashmore's borders 2 days later, joining Rowan's exhausted, badly outnumbered defenders at the Eastern Pass, where Voron's forces had begun to concentrate. The battle that followed was brutal and costly, fought across 3 days of mud and smoke and the particular chaos of two kingdoms learning under fire how to fight as one instead of two. Rowan fought at the front line as he always had, decisive and fearless, in the way that had once seemed like the whole of leadership to him. But it was Lyra working from the command tent with Adrienne and Cedric who identified the weakness in Voron's supply lines that finally turned the battle. The same kind of patient, careful observation that had once kept an entire kingdom running without anyone noticing the hand that steered it. When Voron's forces finally withdrew on the third day, battered and unable to sustain the cost of continued advance, Rowan found Lyra standing at the edge of the makeshift command tent, exhausted, her hands still stained with ink from 3 days of tactical notes, and something in his expression had changed permanently from the man who had once believed strength meant standing at the front of every battle alone. You saved my kingdom, he said quietly. Again. We saved it, Lyra corrected. Adrienne's soldiers, Cedric's strategy. Your defenders who held that pass for 2 days before we arrived. I just noticed a pattern in their supply movements. That's all I've ever done, Rowan. Notice patterns. That's not all you've done, he said. I understand that now. I think I finally understand it completely. He looked at her for a long moment. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. All of it. Everything I let myself not see for 10 years. Thank you for saying that, Lyra said, and found somewhat to her own surprise that she meant it without bitterness. I hope it makes you a better alpha. Going forward, not because I'm owed that, because your people deserve it. She turned and walked back toward Stonehaven's camp, where Adrienne was waiting with 2 cups of tea he'd apparently decided no longer required explanation. And behind her, Rowan stood alone at the edge of the battlefield, watching the woman he'd once believed was replaceable walk away for the second time, this time toward a life that had never needed his permission to matter. The formal alliance between Ashmore and Stonehaven was signed 6 weeks later in a ceremony that drew representatives from every allied territory in the north gathered beneath Stonehaven's Great Hall to witness the formation of what would come to be called in the years that followed the United Northern Territories. The treaty bore Adrienne's seal and Rowan's seal side by side for the first time in the kingdom's long, complicated history, and beneath both, following Stonehaven's old tradition, bore the seal of the advisor, whose work had shaped its every term. Lyra's seal appeared not once, but throughout the document, in the trade provisions she'd drafted, the border agreements she'd negotiated, the mutual defense clauses, built from lessons learned in 3 days of desperate battle. Adrienne stood before the assembled crowd that day, Lyra beside him rather than behind him, and addressed the packed hall with the particular quiet confidence Lyra had come to recognize as entirely his own. 6 months ago, he said, A woman walked into my guardhouse with dust on her boots and no letters of introduction, asking for work, advising a kingdom that had no reason yet to trust her. Some of you have watched what happened since. Some of you have only heard the stories. I want to tell you plainly what actually happened, because I think the truth matters more than the legend. He turned toward Lyra, and something in his expression, warm and unhurried, and entirely without performance, made the great hall go quiet in a different way than before. The greatest kingdom I have ever ruled was first imagined by the woman standing beside me. The hall rose to its feet, and the sound that followed was not the desperate cheering of the Moon Festival crowd that had once celebrated her invisible departure without noticing she'd left. It was something else entirely deliberate and sustained, the particular applause of people who understood exactly what they were honoring. Lyra stood in the center of it, and for the first time in 10 years, she did not feel the familiar instinct to step back, to let the recognition pass over her and settle on someone else's shoulders. She let herself be seen fully in a room full of people who had chosen to see her, and found that the ground held her weight after all. Elder Miriam, watching from the front row, caught Lyra's eye and offered a small, satisfied nod, the particular expression of someone who has finally watched a debt come due. Master Oren, seated beside her with a fresh journal already open on his lap, was already recording the moment in his careful dated notation, the beginning of an archive that would in time hold Lyra's name beside every treaty, every reform, every quiet act of leadership she had once believed needed to stay invisible to be real. Finn, no longer a boy, but a young man now serving as a messenger between the two united courts, stood near the back of the hall and thought of the countless small kindnesses he'd witnessed her offer over the years. The healers sent without fanfare, the birthdays remembered, the quiet competence that had held together a kingdom no one thought to thank her for. He was glad watching her now that the thanking had finally begun. Adrienne took LRA's hand that evening after the ceremony had ended, and the great hall had emptied into the cool spring night, and led her out to the same garden wall where months earlier a single white lily had pushed up through frozen ground in defiance of the season. The garden was full of them now, blooming in unlikely corners where no one had planted them, spreading in the particular way that certain flowers do when the conditions are finally right. "I've been thinking about something," Adrienne said, turning to face her in the lantern light. "The High Chancellor's seat has been empty since the alliance formed. Both kingdoms need someone who understands them equally. Someone whose name should have been on every important document for the last decade, if the world had been fair enough to put it there." "You're offering me a title," Lyra said, something careful and hopeful warring in her voice. "I'm offering you what should have already been yours," Adrienne said. "Not because I'm choosing you for it, because you've already earned it. And I'd like the chance to stop being the only person who noticed. And if I say no, if I just decide I'd rather keep working quietly, the way I always have, then I'll respect that," Adrienne said, "though I'd be lying if I said I wasn't hoping for a different answer." He paused, and something more vulnerable crossed his expression. The particular honesty of a man choosing to risk something instead of protecting himself from disappointment. "I'm not only asking about the title, Lyra. I think you know that." She studied him for a long moment. The king who had noticed her before anyone asked him to, who had insisted on tea and honesty, and her own seal beside his on documents that mattered, who had never once asked her to disappear so his own light could shine more brightly. "I choose this," she said finally, quietly, testing the words the way she tested every important decision. Carefully, honestly, without letting herself rush toward comfort before she was certain it was true. "Not because it's safe. Not because I need somewhere to belong. Because I've spent 10 years discovering that I'm allowed to want things for myself. And I want this. I want you. I want to stand beside someone instead of behind them." "Then stand beside me," Adrienne said. And when he kissed her beneath a garden full of white lies blooming out of season, it felt less like the culmination of a fairy tale, and more like the quiet, steady beginning of a partnership. Neither of them had needed fate to arrange for them. They had built it themselves, the way Lyra had always built everything that mattered, one careful, deliberate choice at a time. Lyra was formally invested as High Chancellor of the United Northern Territories. 1 year to the day, after she had set down a silver clasp on a stone wall in Ashmore and walked away into the dark, the ceremony was held not in a great hall, but in the central marketplace of the newly unified capital, deliberately at Adrienne's insistence, so that the people whose lives her work had shaped could witness the moment themselves rather than hear it secondhand. Rowan attended as Ashmore's alpha, standing among the assembled crowd rather than at the front of it, a small but deliberate choice that Lyra noticed and appreciated more than she let herself show. He had spent the years since the invasion learning slowly and imperfectly the particular humility required of a leader who has finally understood how much of his strength had never actually been his own. He had begun keeping his own records now, careful and dated, in a habit he'd clearly borrowed from watching her work. Lady Selene stood beside him, no longer wearing the confident certainty of a woman raised to expect automatic difference, but something more thoughtful, the beginning of an understanding that leadership required more than the accident of birth. Elder Miriam spoke first at the ceremony, her voice carrying clearly across the crowded square. 10 years ago, a girl of 16 walked into Ashmore's council chamber and asked for nothing but the chance to be useful. She gave this territory 10 years of quiet, uncredited devotion, and when we finally lost sight of her value, we lost nearly everything else along with it. Today we correct that failure, not because it is owed to her as an apology, but because it is owed to every person who has ever done essential work that no one thought to name. Master Oren followed, holding up the leather-bound archive he had spent the past year compiling every treaty, every reform, every quiet act of leadership Lyra had shaped, carefully documented and cross-referenced in her honor. Let it be recorded, he said, that the strongest foundations of any kingdom are the ones that go unnoticed until they disappear. Let it be recorded that we finally learned to notice in time. When Alara herself stepped forward to speak, the marketplace fell into the particular quiet of a crowd that understood it was witnessing something worth remembering. She thought of the 16-year-old girl who had walked into Ashmore, believing usefulness was the only thing that made her worth keeping. She thought of the silver clasp on the stone wall, the long walk through an oblivious crowd, the countless small threads of trust and competence she had woven invisibly through a kingdom that never thought to ask her name. I spent a long time believing that being needed and being valued were the same thing, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. I want every person standing here today, every person doing the quiet, unglamorous work that makes a kingdom function to understand that they are not the same thing at all. You can be desperately needed and still be entirely unseen. I was for 10 years, and I didn't understand what was missing until I finally found a place willing to see me. She paused, looking out at the crowd, at Cedric's steady approval, at Finn's proud smile, at Rowan's quiet, humbled attention near the back. I'm not standing here today because I finally became valuable enough to deserve recognition. I was always valuable. I simply finally found people willing to say so out loud. The applause that followed rolled across the marketplace like weather, and somewhere in the crowd, children who had grown up in the year since the Alliance's formation, who had never known a northern territory divided by anything but the ordinary business of trade and travel, cheered without fully understanding what they were witnessing, simply certain that something worth celebrating had happened. 5 years later, the marketplace still bore the marks of that day, though the crowds had long since dispersed into the ordinary business of an ordinary afternoon. Traders called out prices from their stalls. Children chased each other between market carts, exactly as they had on the night of Rowan's Moon Festival, though none of them had been alive to witness it. Caravans moved smoothly along roads Lyra had helped redesign, carrying grain and cloth and the particular prosperity of two kingdoms that had finally learned to function as one. At the center of the square stood a bronze statue, commissioned by Adrian and unveiled on the 5th anniversary of the Alliance's founding. Not of a king with a raised sword, not of a warrior in battle armor, but of a woman seated at a council table, maps spread before her, one hand resting on an open journal, her expression calm and observant, the particular stillness of someone who has spent her life noticing what everyone else walks past. Beneath the statue, carved into the stone base in careful, permanent letters, was a single line that every child in the United Territories would grow up knowing by heart, whether or not they ever learned the full story behind it. Kingdoms are strongest when every hand that builds them is seen. Lyra walked past the statue most mornings on her way to the council chamber, often with Adrian beside her, sometimes alone, and she had never quite grown accustomed to the particular strangeness of seeing her own likeness cast in bronze, though she had, in the 5 years since, grown entirely accustomed to something far more important, the quiet, unshakable certainty that she no longer needed to disappear to be valued. She still kept her leather journals, still filled them with careful, dated notes, still noticed the small, invisible patterns that most people walked past without seeing. But her name appeared beside every treaty now, every reform, every quiet act of leadership that shaped the daily lives of thousands of people who had never once had to wonder who was holding their kingdom together. On the anniversary of the alliance each year, the marketplace filled again with the particular joy of people who understood exactly what they were celebrating. Not a victory won through conquest, but a foundation rebuilt through the simple, radical act of finally seeing the person who had been carrying it all along. And each year, standing beside Adrian in the golden evening light, watching children play in the shadow of a statue that would outlast them both, Lyra let herself feel without hesitation, without the old reflex to minimize or deflect the full and quiet weight of being exactly as visible as she had always deserved to be. Thank you for watching. Please support the channel and help me get to 1,000 subscribers. And see you on the next.